Russia is losing the war, not just on the battlefield, but at the bank. Behind the front lines, Putin's war machine is falling apart. Sanctions are crushing the economy. Cash is running out, and no matter how many missiles he fires, there's one enemy he can't defeat: maths. What's happening inside Russia's economy right now is more than a downturn, it's a ticking time bomb. And once you see the numbers, you'll understand why Russia can never win this war. Let's pull back the curtain on the economic disaster that's ripping the Kremlin apart from the inside out. Russia's largest shipping company, Sovcomflot, recently released its Q1 2025 earnings report. The numbers are devastating, a $393 million loss. Now that might not sound catastrophic until you realize that just 1 year earlier, in Q1 2024, the same company posted a $216 million profit on its operations. That's a swing of over $500 million in just 12 months. From a healthy profit to massive losses that would spell trouble for any company regardless of its size. And this isn't some struggling startup, but Russia's flagship shipping company, supposedly insulated from the worst effects of sanctions. But Sovcomflot isn't an outlier, it's a preview of what's happening across Russia's entire economy. To understand why exactly we're looking at Sovcomflot, you have to understand the nature of Western sanctions on Russia. Primarily, these sanctions prevent Russia from exporting oil and gas using shipping lanes and ports throughout Europe. To dodge these sanctions, Russian shipping companies, including Sovcomflot, have turned to using the so-called shadow fleet to transport oil. These ships are relatively old tankers flying foreign flags, which evade traditional shipping checks and lanes, or use a complex series of contracts to hide the fact that the oil is coming from Russia in the first place. The shadow fleet has been responsible for keeping Russia's economy afloat, as it's estimated to contain roughly 10% of all oil shipping vessels in the world. However, the ships themselves need to make significantly longer journeys, or the contracts involved pay out less than legal shipping due to the inherent risks. The combination of a lack of viable contracts and the switch to less economic ways to export products means that companies like Sovcomflot will continue to be strangled by Western sanctions, and those sanctions are likely going to expand over time. Countries such as Germany, Estonia, and Finland have all found themselves in the spotlight after seizures or increased checks on ships going out from Russia via the Baltic Sea. Sweden has also announced it would stop and inspect every ship it finds in its exclusive economic zone, which extends to the only shipping lane between the Baltic and the North Sea and therefore the Atlantic, citing that Russia's fleet is no longer sufficiently powerful or threatening enough to be able to escort every shadow fleet ship in the region. This economic warfare between the EU and Russia is slightly undermined by the fact that some European countries are still technically importing Russian fossil fuels, to the point where some members spent more money on Russian oil and gas than they pledged to Ukraine. However, the growing sentiment in Europe is that it needs to become energetically independent or switch its main importers to the US, Norway, and other countries not affiliated with Russia, or BRICS, as well as increasing sanctions, which should hopefully slow that revenue stream. The Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air has outlined that increasing the sanctions has evolved from a policy tool to a practical necessity, and that persistence is key to real impact. On the global view, Russian fossil fuel export revenue took a nosedive of around 33% since February 2022, with shorter-term trends suggesting increasing losses with very few options of bouncing back to 2024 levels, let alone pre-war levels. Of course, Russia's oil and gas exports are just one of the levers it has at its disposal to fund its economy. However, it soon becomes obvious that other levers all lead to ruin, eventually. Putin faces what economists call an impossible trinity. 3 goals that cannot be achieved simultaneously. First, keep the war machine running at full capacity. Second, maintain a functional domestic economy. And third, avoid economic collapse. While the second 2 goals are relatively easy to achieve in tandem for countries without wars or excessive corruption, Russia would need to sacrifice its ability to fund its military and weapons research and development. Putin has ostensibly chosen the first goal at the expense of the other 2. This is showcased by Russia dedicating an estimated 40% of its entire federal budget to defense spending, with a third of it being hidden from public review and classified under top secret. To put that into perspective, even during World War II, the United States, the world's largest economy, peaked at around 37% military spending, and that was during an existential global conflict with clear victory conditions. In contrast, Russia is spending World War II-level resources on a regional conflict without real measurements on what constitutes victory beyond complete control over Ukraine or its surrender. Even worse, Russia has had negligible progress toward those ambiguous goals over the past 2 or 3 years of the war. But here's where it gets truly insane. Russian companies aren't operating under normal market conditions. They're operating under what can only be described as war socialism. The Kremlin is forcing private companies to continue production at government-mandated prices, regardless of profitability. When these companies inevitably start losing money, the government forces Russian banks to issue loans at below-market rates. This has both long-term and short-term effects on the entire economic system. Central bank rates are over 20%, but connected companies are getting loans at 7 to 9%. But these same companies are required to pay whatever it takes to hire workers in a labor market where unemployment is under 2%. Having a low unemployment rate might sound good, but it's actually below the healthy level of between 3 to 4%. This indicates that the country is going through severe labor shortages. The labor shortage directly results in wage inflation, with companies needing to lure in workers with increasingly generous payouts, which circle back to needing more loans to fund the company. At the same time, Russia has practically made most of its large companies owned by individuals within Russia. The lack of international funding means that it's Russian citizens who need to purchase and trade bonds for companies, and if that fails, the entire company could collapse from within. The result is that Russian companies are accumulating massive debt loads while being prohibited from making the business decisions necessary to stay profitable. It's capitalism in name only, failing socialism with corporate logos attached. To counter that, Russia has started increasing the taxes on both companies and citizens, with significant increases across fields and taxation types. This puts further strain on the domestic economy to be self-sufficient while being drained by the fact that 40% of that is being put into the military-industrial complex and war. And those same Russian banks issuing loans are basically performing a delicate balancing act. They currently maintain only 9.5% liquid assets, compared to the international standard of 20 to 30%. In plain English, if Russian citizens wanted to withdraw their money en masse, the banking system would collapse almost immediately, as the bank would only be able to liquidate less than a tenth of what its customers have deposited in their accounts. If that sounds unlikely, consider the recent announcement that the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs proposed making personal loans illegal, officially to prevent fraud. While it could work like the announcement suggests, in practice, it's more likely just a way for banks to prevent further lending, which would dig them deeper into a liquidity crisis. When your government is seriously considering banning people from borrowing money, your financial system is in terminal decline. And even if Russia could somehow solve its economic problems overnight, it faces an even more fundamental issue, literally running out of people. Current estimates put Russian military casualties at above 1 million, killed and wounded combined. That's from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, but even the estimates from the Center for Strategic and International Studies have suggested that the number is most definitely hitting 1 million by late summer of 2025. And that's just the beginning of Russia's demographic nightmare. Another estimated 900,000 Russians have fled the country to avoid conscription, a number reported in 2023 and still echoed in 2024. While estimates vary, most place the total between 500,000 and 1 million, making it the largest wave of emigration since 1917. There are no precise statistics on what happened in the last 12 months, emigration-wise, but most reports indicate that emigrated Russians are unwilling to return to the country. Supposing that a third of those are military-age men, with the other two-thirds being women and children in equal ratios, which is a crude estimate, over 1.2 million men and another 300,000 women could have been erased from Russia's economy over 3 years. And remember, Russia already had a demographic crisis before the war started. Low birth rates following the Soviet collapse, with a historical low of only 1.2 births per woman in the late 90s, mean there simply aren't enough young people to replace these losses. So Russia has an economy that is extremely problematic and has siphoned even its people to continue the war effort. But even that war effort so far has been meandering. Remember Russia's opening gambit at Hostomel Airport? Elite paratroopers were supposed to establish an air bridge to quickly fly in reinforcements and supplies for the assault on Kyiv. Instead, Ukrainian conscripts managed to hold the airport for a vital few hours against these supposedly elite units, and the entire operation collapsed, which only led to additional logistical difficulties north of Kyiv. This resulted in the infamous 40-mile convoy stretching toward the Ukrainian capital, a traffic jam of Russian armor that ran out of fuel just miles from the border. Ukrainian forces could then pick off vehicles at will, while the world watched Russia's military incompetence unfold in real time via satellite imagery. 2 years later, Russia was deploying museum pieces on the battlefield, T-62 tanks from the 1960s, T-55s from the 1950s, and reports even suggest T-34s from World War II are making appearances. On the other hand, its supposedly modern armor, like the T-90Ms and the T-14 Armata, was either being destroyed for the former or was completely pulled out within 2 weeks of being deployed. When you're pulling 80-year-old tanks out of storage, you're not exactly projecting cutting-edge military capability. Ukraine has proven that modern warfare doesn't require superpower-level resources, but innovation, adaptability, and intelligent use of technology. While Russia faltered, Ukraine was building something far more valuable, a genuine, long-term European commitment to its goals. Germany, which was once hesitant to send even its old and refurbished Soviet weaponry, has become one of Ukraine's largest military suppliers. The country also instituted a new military spending funnel, which would allow it to borrow up to $800 billion to reform its military and improve domestic research and production. Poland is building what will soon be Europe's largest standing army, explicitly designed to counter Russian aggression. Finland and Sweden didn't just join NATO, they're pushing their military-industrial complexes to maximum capacity, sending cutting-edge prototypes to Ukrainian forces. The UK has sent multiple anti-air system prototypes, built to utilize what Ukraine already has at its disposal from Soviet supplies. France has started to supply Ukraine with domestic Mirage 2000 fighter jets, reducing the latter's reliance on old US tech, surveillance, and software updates. This isn't charity, but strategic investment. If Ukraine falls, Europe could very well be next, and NATO isn't keen on sending its own troops to die against Russia just yet. And even then, some countries like France have already proposed doing just that in Ukraine. The European approach has been methodical and devastating. This was contrasted by the US repeatedly switching sides in the Russia-Ukraine diplomacy and appeasing Russia, all through President Donald Trump's long-standing personal friendship with Putin. Trump entered office promising to end the Ukraine war within 24 hours through sheer force of his deal-making personality. His approach was classic Trump: bring both sides to the table, apply pressure, and emerge as the peacemaking hero. But Putin had no intention of playing along. Trump spent months offering political concessions to Moscow, hoping to build enough goodwill for a grand bargain. His administration amended G7 language to avoid calling Russia the aggressor. The US disbanded the Yale Task Force tracking stolen Ukrainian children. Secretary of State Marco Rubio publicly testified that the US hadn't given Russia any concessions, but the political signals were unmistakable. Meanwhile, Trump insisted on maintaining trade opportunities with Russia, even though US-Russia trade made up just 0.066% of total US trade in 2024. Russia was absent from Trump's sweeping reforms of trade tariffs, which sparked a trade war between the US and Canada, Mexico, and China. Think about the absurdity. Trump was willing to damage relationships with World War II allies over trade relationships that are essentially a rounding error in the scale of the US economy. And Trump's appeasement strategy backfired spectacularly on both sides. Putin, emboldened by Trump's rapid switches from one statement to the next, became even more detached from the reality of Russia's inability to capture more land and make progress in Ukraine. Russian officials started making increasingly outrageous territorial demands, talking about natural borders of the old Soviet Union and the Russian Empire that would include the Baltic states. Putin's legal advisors began claiming the Soviet Union's dissolution was never legal, therefore, Russia had claims to vast territories across Eastern Europe. And the more Trump offered, the more Putin demanded. The Istanbul talks, which should have started a long-term ceasefire, went nowhere. Direct negotiations with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky failed, with months-long plans of minerals deals between the US and Ukraine being redrafted by the day as Ukraine refused to give away its resources for nothing in return. Putin refused every ceasefire proposal, breaking even limited humanitarian truces such as the famous Easter Truce by sending thousands of drones and missiles into Ukraine. Ukraine responded with attacks of its own, and Russia claimed that it was the wronged party and was vehemently attempting to approach the negotiating table with no actual moves to support that. Trump finally realized what European leaders had understood from the beginning. Putin interprets concessions as weakness, not goodwill. But instead of changing his tune and adopting an approach that echoed the rest of NATO, the US completely abandoned Russia-Ukraine negotiations and turned its attention to the can of worms that is the Middle East, where Russia is also involved, even if indirectly. Trump's diplomatic approach has been called transactional and business-driven, using economics rather than geopolitics to iron out details that would have long-term repercussions for governments. His style was to exert as much pressure on the opposing side to get ahead in the negotiations, striking a deal where he is the winner. Global geopolitics doesn't work the same way. International relations have many more components, and changing one can have a butterfly effect on others that can negatively influence the very nature of the component being brokered over. At the same time, Vice President J.D. Vance's efforts to paint Trump's lack of diplomatic progress have made some critics suggest that he's tone-deaf and morally wrong. This ineffectual combination of president and vice president has made many NATO allies wary of just how veritable claims from the US Foreign Ministry are and how they align with the basic goals of the alliance itself. While Trump was chasing diplomatic fantasies, European leaders were building real solutions. And here's what's truly damaging to Russia's long-term prospects. European support is more sustainable and more strategically coherent than anything Trump offered. Unlike Trump's personality-driven diplomacy, European support is institutional. It's built into defense budgets, industrial planning, and military doctrine. When Germany commits to training Ukrainian pilots, those pilots will be flying European-maintained aircraft with European logistics support for decades. More importantly, European leaders understand that this isn't just about Ukraine, but about the entire post-war security architecture in Europe. That's why even traditionally neutral countries like Switzerland are participating in Ukrainian support. The European approach is also more economically sustainable. Instead of grand gestures, Europeans are building long-term industrial capacity. Defense contractors across Europe are retooling to produce Ukrainian-compatible systems. This creates jobs, builds expertise, and ensures that support can continue regardless of political changes in individual countries. Furthermore, those long-term strategies are directly undermining both Trump and Putin's efforts to make Europe more reliant on offshore support. France has proposed removing American nuclear warheads from bases in Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands, with the UK and France providing nuclear deterrence for Europe. As European nations systematically built this support network, they are simultaneously crafting the most effective economic warfare campaign in modern history. While Russia initially seemed to weather the first waves of sanctions, the long-term effects are likely just now starting to show. The recent EU sanctions on Shadow Fleet tankers have devastated companies like Sovcomflot, sanctioning 189 vessels in the latest package alone. European leaders aren't just throwing sanctions at the wall to see what sticks, they're systematically dismantling Russia's ability to fund the war. From Putin's perspective, he's traded his most valuable Western asset, Trump's political goodwill, for absolutely nothing. No territorial concessions, no sanctions relief, no diplomatic recognition. It's been a complete strategic loss. When the US pulled out of negotiations, the rest of Europe didn't follow, and Russia is still stuck with Ukraine, which is receiving weapons from the West. This brings us to Putin's ultimate dilemma, which has become exponentially worse since losing Trump as a potential ally. He faces three impossible choices, and his strategic position has deteriorated dramatically. Putin could double down militarily, potentially even using tactical nuclear weapons, but this would invite NATO retaliation and render the Ukrainian territory uninhabitable, defeating the entire purpose of the invasion. Alternatively, admitting defeat would likely trigger regime collapse. Putin's entire legitimacy rests on projecting strength. A humiliating withdrawal from Ukraine would signal to Russia's elite Putin is finished. This option has become even more dangerous because Putin can no longer point to Western pressure as a face-saving explanation for withdrawal. The final option, negotiation, is where Putin's loss of Trump becomes most damaging. Ukraine has no incentives to give away territory after successfully defending for 3 years, especially with strong European backing that's institutionally sustainable. Russia can't accept any deal that doesn't legitimize its territorial gains. But most critically, Putin has lost his primary Western negotiating partner and has no realistic path to better terms. Trump's walking away from the peace negotiations sends a clear signal to other potential mediators. Putin is not a reliable negotiating partner. No Western leader wants to be the next Trump, spending months offering concessions only to be embarrassed by Putin's intransigence. And remember, Russia had occupied roughly 18% of Ukraine by the end of 2022. In mid-2025, we are only adding decimal points to this percentage, while the casualty counts multiply. According to an analysis by Forbes, Russia would need approximately 230 years to fully occupy Ukraine. This would require around 100 million Russian casualties against a total Russian population of 144 million. Russia doesn't have the time, money, or personnel for a complete occupation, and its only real option is to continue bleeding Ukraine's military until there's nothing left to defend Ukraine. But Europe has much bigger coffers and can prop up Ukraine's economy practically indefinitely. So Putin is trapped. He can't win, can't quit, can't negotiate, and can no longer count on Western political cover for any of these choices. And with Putin trapped, Russia will fall when he inevitably makes any choice that isn't the current status quo, as all choices are wrong. If you want to learn how Ukraine has managed to turn the tide of the war, subscribe to The Military Show for daily news and updates, and thank you, as always, for watching.